What I was asked by Tim to do was to give an overview of the issues and to look particularly at the politics and the law and all the rest of that sort of aspect of it, which I will do. I'll try briefly to set out a bit of the back history and then move into the present crisis in the Middle East and its impact on heritage. And then finally to just say, but not at enormous length, what, if anything, in present circumstances now, while it's all going on, can be done, and what should we be looking for in future by way of providing better protection or rehabilitation for the monuments that exist or existed until now in the countries that are affected by conflict. I will say that I come to this subject with a lot of diffidence, but also enthusiasm. I mean, diffident because I'm an amateur, but I have spent, as Tim said, 45 years in the Arab world, more or less, on and off, but most of the time there. And I've got a good deal of pleasure from visiting monuments and engaging with the people, like our speakers later this afternoon, who are true experts. And some of them have helped me in sort of preparing what I have to say today. I will say also that my own experience, which has been in, when I was there during the Iraq War, I was there actually previously during the 73 war, I was there on the periphery of the present conflict in Syria, representing the United Nations as the special coordinator for Lebanon. So I have a sense also, first of all, of our responsibilities, I mean our British responsibilities as a country that has repeatedly gone to war in this region and is actually presently in a rather limited fashion engaged in combat there still. And I'm also very conscious, but particularly because of my work in Beirut, where I was responsible for the political aspects of the refugee presence and the relations with the Lebanese government and so on, of the need for a sense of proportion when we're talking about this. I mean, we have to be real. In Syria alone, 250,000, or perhaps if you take another estimate, 400,000 people have died in the conflict over the past 5 years. 6 million people are actually registered as refugees in neighboring countries. Yeah, over 5 million. 6 million are displaced within Syria. So, I mean, all right, to add to it, the last few weeks have seen an appalling battle in Aleppo with atrocities, with the bombing of schools and the murder of children. And it would be grotesque, I think, in these circumstances, just to single out the fact that at the heart of Aleppo is a World Heritage Site. But it is. It's very beautiful, it was, as I know. Already the Great Mosque and the Citadel have been damaged, and the souks in their entirety have been burnt to the ground. So, and this is an integral, I think what I'm trying to say is that this is an integral part of a wider humanitarian crisis. But it is a humanitarian crisis. It is a part of the humanitarian crisis because future generations of Syrians are going to be much the poorer because of what has been happening in their country now. And that goes to the subject that we have to discuss today. And so, on top of that, will we be poorer? Anyway, to turn to the background, to move to the back history, so to speak, it was this sort of thinking that I've just mentioned, in the sense that we're all going to be poorer as a result of the loss of heritage that occurs in conflicts, as well as the perception that actually, if you destroy your enemy's cultural property, you're not actually going about things in the right way if you want to win the peace afterwards. That it was this that underpinned the sort of efforts that were made in the last century, and even back in the 19th century, to begin to try to establish some sort of legal framework within which cultural property would be protected in times of war. I mean, it goes back right to the American Civil War. You can go back to the Napoleonic Wars, and you can see instances of people taking judgments, issuing decisions which relate to this. But actually, just before the First World War, people were experimenting with conventions. They had little impact. Then, in the Second World War, we had the bombing of historic cities by both sides. You had the expropriation. Oh, gosh. expropriation of cultural property by the Nazis. And at the end of the war, people had the thought collectively that something needed to be done about this. We really should codify things. And so it came to pass in 1954 that there was international agreement on something called the Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of war, at the heart of which is written into international law the obligation to protect, and there's a great long list of what it involves in terms of types of sites and so on. I mean, what types of property we're talking about, but to protect such property in times of war, except in cases of imperative military necessity. And there was an additional protocol which was all about effectively trading in the spoils of war. Now, this all falls under the auspices of UNESCO, and later you get the 1970 Convention, which is about illicit trafficking more generally. You get the 1972 Convention, which actually sets up a system. This is not about war, neither the 70 or 72 one, but sets up a system whereby World Heritage Sites are designated. And that plays a part in the discussion we're going to have about the Middle East, I think, now. Now, the truth is that memories fade fairly quickly. And during the Cold War, interest in the Hague Convention slipped. It was all a bit difficult to implement. It wasn't the most brilliant convention in the world as originally drafted. And really, it slipped off a lot of people's radar, even though the majority of countries had signed up for it. In the Yugoslav war, you get a return of interest. I mean, Dubrovnik was hit with rockets from outside. It's a World Heritage Site. The ancient bridge at Mostar was destroyed in a big sort of, clearly a political move to destroy it. And this animated the powers that be, in Europe in particular, and a second protocol was written, which is a bit more precise, and which addresses more specifically internal conflicts as well as interstate conflicts, and names something called the Blue Shield, which is a sort of group of NGO committees which has been set up in countries around the world to advise UNESCO on the implementation of the convention. So it's progressing. And the lawyer's view, the international lawyer's view, is that this convention is now a part of customary international law. It's not been used directly. There isn't a mechanism directly to pursue people building on it. But the tribunals that have been set up for Yugoslavia, for example, the International Criminal Court, this is really important, have incorporated it. And after Dubrovnik, people were arrested, imprisoned, prosecuted in the Yugoslav tribunal for what they had done. And now, very importantly, this year, the International Criminal Court is presently trying somebody from Mali, a religious extremist, one of the people who had led the sort of the extreme jihadi campaign there, for the destruction of Sufi shrines in the World Heritage Site of Timbuktu. And that site is being reconstructed, restored by UNESCO. So there's a sort of corpus of international law and activity here, which is important. It's important to internalize it, I think. Coming now to the Middle East. Before we go right to the wars that are presently happening, I just want to say a few words about Iraq. We have an expert here on Iraq, so I'm a bit nervous about doing it. But just to say, to remind people really, that we, I mean the UK and the US, played a negative role in respect of heritage in Iraq in 2003. It was perhaps a crime of omission rather than commission, but nonetheless, it was very negative in its impact. At the time of the 2003 invasion, neither the US nor the UK had signed up to the Hague Convention. In the months leading up to the invasion, there was a real effort, I think, in the United States, and an effort here by at least one engaged academic to feed in information, to deliver. I don't know what was the Chilcot Inquiry will tell you, but I think this is the case, to try to get people to think about places that were going to need protection in this conflict. The military were, as Tim says, going into battle in the cradle of civilization without plans or expertise or, crucially, actually the personnel to provide protection when it was needed. And one of those who attempted to advise, Professor Peter Stone, who's now the head of the Blue Shield in the UK, professor at Newcastle University, has written, I just quote him because he knows, "Remarkably and essentially by luck, very little destruction of cultural property happened during the conflict part of the invasion. But as soon as the regime collapsed, there was endemic looting of museums, libraries, and archaeological sites across the country. This included the looting of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. It included the burning of the National Archive. And the off-the-cuff comment of Donald Rumsfeld after that, which we were discussing just a moment ago, was, stuff happens. You know, that's when he said it. That's what he said it about. And stuff continued to happen. It continued to happen on our watch for some time following the invasion, not least as a result of the subsequent de-Baathification, the dismantling of the institutions of the state, and the stimulus that was given to sectarianism and to Al-Qaeda type extremism, out of which now has come, of course, ISIS. And in the shadow of the violence, there was looting and there was destruction of shrines like the great Shia mosque in Samarra and so on. Now, I think people recognize the mistakes, and both the US military and the British military sought to compensate by doing surveys and so on of the antiquities in their area, trying to help the antiquities organization and so on. And in the South in particular, John Curtis, who some of you will know, the British Museum, was involved in that. And one of the later fruits of it was an attempt to, or not an attempt, to restore the Basra Museum. And actually, amazingly, that new museum, a new Basra Museum, will open this September. So, you know, people sought to redeem themselves, but to do right. Let's come on now to not just Iraq, but to the other countries in which conflict is presently taking place in the Arab world. In Syria, Libya, and Yemen, really, in addition to Iraq. And each of these conflicts has its roots, really, its immediate roots, and has roots in the distant past. You know, let's be frank about that. But it has its immediate roots in what happened in 2011. With the Arab Spring, the popular revolutions that took place, particularly in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. And in Iraq, actually, in contrast to what I'd said before, I would say the particular event which is notable in that year is the withdrawal, finally, of all American troops, because it sort of gave space for the conflict to flare up again after the surge. The pressures on, we should be clear too, I mean, if we're talking about conflict as the source of trouble for heritage and heritage sites in the Arab world, we should be careful, I think, not to ignore other reasons too. For decades now, the Arab world has seen extraordinary growth in population, urbanization. And 2011 added on top of all that a layer of political instability and insecurity, which also has impacted on heritage. I mean, Egypt is a country that perhaps I know best because I lived part of my time there. And stuff happened there too as a result of it, with the encroachment on sites, the looting of sites. I mean, law and order for a period broke down. Some of it was so high profile, the bulldozing of sites around the pyramids in Dashur, or the trashing of the museum in Malawi, which is a lovely little museum in Upper Egypt. And these things, the authorities intervened and did do something to restore and to police and so on, because it's not as bad as the situation that we're about to talk about, or I'm about to turn to now. But nonetheless, if you talk to archaeologists or to academics who are concerned in Egypt, they will say this is now a pandemic. And the answer is, you know, a broad-based campaign to actually involve communities, to make them understand if they don't understand. And many do. In Malawi, they sort of rallied around their museum. but to make them understand the value of it and the importance of it if they don't already. Now, in Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Libya, what's happening now? I mean, the immediacy of the threat to heritage in times of conflict is greater than what I've described before, this sort of erosion of security or protection because of economic and social factors and so on. It's of a different order. And the threat can take really 3 or 4 forms. One is looting, which we'll hear about shortly. Another is collateral damage by misadventure or because combatants just disregard some monument or historic site, or deliberate destruction, which Tim was talking about. Or, and I don't propose to talk about this at great length, but actually there is also a loss of what people these days, I've discovered, grandly call intangible heritage, which means customs, traditions, skills, and so on. And if you've got 12 million people displaced, and they're living in very bizarre circumstances, many of them in other countries, they lose their traditions quite quickly. Well, they can do anyway, as a result of such displacement, unless there's an enormous effort to bring people together and to resume and so on. So that's another way in which war can threaten cultural property of a sort. It's not easy to sort of say, how much of this has happened, or where's it going next? Because these conflicts are still going on, and a lot of the places we're talking about, there isn't access for people from outside, or even for a lot of the time local people who are concerned. I'll just say I'll go through them quickly, but looting, in Syria it happens everywhere. It happens, not everywhere, no, that's wrong. It happens in areas which are controlled by the regime, in areas which are controlled by the opposition, and in areas which are controlled by ISIS. The place that we were shown earlier by Tim was Afamia, that's how the Arabs pronounce it, but Apamia, and that's regime-controlled. Another place he might have shown, which is another of these great pockmarked pictures you'll see of sites where there's been looting, digging, is Dura Europos, which I think, Tim, is actually under ISIS control just. It's another Greco-Roman site just at the Roman site at the border between what was Rome and what was Parthia, really, but in ISIS-controlled country. And the other thing I'd say about it is there's obviously an economic driver for it, because people now just don't have much by way of income in these, particularly in remote areas. However, they wouldn't be doing it were there not an illegal trade and people making a lot of money out of it. And we fear, at least, ISIS among their numbers, either directly or because they tax the people who do it. In terms of collateral damage, it happens. Again, everybody could be responsible. The regime, I have to say, is in Syria is careless in its barrel bombing, and I would cite at least one case. There's a place called Marat Nouman, which is near another World Heritage Site, which is beautiful, actually. It's they call it, bizarrely, the ancient Byzantine villages of northern Syria. It doesn't really tend to give you the sort of sense of magic of a village which is virtually intact but empty, and has been ever since Byzantine times. Well, the mosaics there, wisely, were put in a museum in a caravanserai in Marat Nouman, and it was struck directly. And anyway, the caravanserai is gone. Actually, and we'll come to this later, a lot of work had been done training, supporting people who were looking after this museum, and they managed to protect most of the mosaics. But it was a direct strike, and there can be no reason for hitting it. Which brings us to ISIS, which is what Tim was talking about, really. And somebody else will be saying, hopefully, inshallah, something about ISIS and their ideology shortly. But, destroying cultural heritage has been one of their trademarks through 2014, 2015, when they expanded in Syria and Iraq. Their brand of sort of Salafi jihadism is particular, and of course it's led them to proclaim a caliphate, and a state without boundaries, but actually with the vision of these boundaries just expanding exponentially forever and enslaving or eliminating anybody who comes in their path and doesn't accept their particular version of Islam. That's That's my interpretation of their political theology, so to speak. They have been particularly ruthless. I mean, it's destroying, to be frank, destroying monuments and so on is not confined to them. I mean, you'll find it's a characteristic of jihadi, Salafi, Takfiri, extremists besides them. But they have been peculiarly ruthless in their campaign. And of course, they control now an area which is very large and which is full of very beautiful things. They're also, and this is about their motivation, very gifted propagandists. And I think in their actions, they're just trying to say, well, that's it. The past is finished. To cow the population and to show us that they're in charge. And that's certainly why they video it, put it online, as they did in the case of the Mosul Museum or the Temple of Balshamin in Palmyra. And we're all shocked. But our shock is right, and our outrage is right. I do not buy Tim's line about the dissolution of the monasteries. This is the 21st century. There is a burden of international law. These are war crimes, and like the gentleman in Mali, some of them at least should end up in a court. Well, either that or they will be finished. Anyway, that's my view. They haven't been confined, these acts, to Assyrian or classical heritage. Religious sites have suffered equally or more. The area of Iraq that they occupied, again, Mark will talk about it, but it was very religiously diverse with different communities. And actually, I guess, but again, he would know, probably more Sunni and Shia Islamic sites have been destroyed than ones of other types. 38, an expert I heard say, reportedly attacked and destroyed in and around Mosul during the sort of 6 or 7 months around the time that they actually took the place over. And Christian monuments attacked or destroyed included a monastery, Bahnam, I think, which went back to the 4th century. And the manuscripts there, which is a particular interest of mine, nobody knows what happened to them, but the monks were expelled. And if you happen to be Yazidi or Shia, you didn't just get expelled, worse things happened to you. So, you know, the Director General of Unesco, I'm not sure how much I'm doing for time, but the Director General of Unesco described all this as cultural cleansing, which I think sort of hits the spot, really. In doing it, ISIS and administration aspire to model themselves on the first 4 caliphs. But actually, if you know anything about the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he famously, when he conquered Jerusalem, when the patriarch said, Fadl, come to the Holy Sepulchre, declined to pray there on the grounds that if he had prayed there, his followers would have said it should be converted to a mosque. Similarly, but this would worry ISIS less, when Suleiman the Magnificent, hundreds of years later, visited Aleppo, he too betrayed a rather different view of these matters. This wouldn't worry them at all, but I just like the quote, so I'm going to give it to you. A European traveller of the period, when Suleiman visited Aleppo, was urged by his advisors to expel the Jews from the city, pointed to a flower pot that held a quantity of fine flowers of diverse colours, and bid them to consider whether each of the flowers in their colours did not set out the other the better. The more sorts I have in my dominions, he said, under me, the greater the authority they bring to my kingdoms, and that nothing may fall off from my greatness. I think it convenient that all that have been here together long hitherto may be kept and tolerated so still for the future. This is really just to say, this isn't Islam. It's not Islam, it's not caliphs, it's not the history of Islam, it's a perversion. Now, the good news is that our ISIS expansion has been checked over the past year. It's lost 40% of the populated territory it controls in Iraq, thanks to coalition action and Iraqi action. In Syria, it's lost 10 to 20% of the land, the populated territory it controlled. Obviously there, of course, because of the Syrian army mainly, and the Russians. There's local disaffection, people say. Several of the leaders have been killed. The group is dependent on foreign fighters. All of this. You know, if the borders are moving backwards rather than forwards, the whole rationale looks a bit thinner. But I have to say, I'm going to bring you a great message of hope. I mean, it would be a rash man who would stand here and say, well, you know, the threat is diminishing. The loss of Palmyra was followed by their capturing an oil field that they had, an oil gas field, actually not so very far to the north. They continue to control a vast area, including 3 major cities, Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, and Mosul, and they tax the population, they enforce their rule. The area may shrink further, but you won't really see a real transformation in this situation, I think, until such time as there are land campaigns against them in Syria and Iraq, and those land campaigns are supported by a measure of political accommodation, i.e. the folks in Geneva have to get somewhere to make it possible, and that seems to me to be politically the case. Otherwise, I would predict that this will continue for some time. Just a word about Palmyra. It's really good that Ma'mun Abdul Karim, who's the Director General of Antiquities in Syria, was able to report that the damage wasn't quite as bad as people thought, although, of course, the 2 famous temples were destroyed and some funerary towers. There was a lot to do by way of tidying up and assessing the damage and all that sort of thing. But you have to bear in mind, and this just goes to the sort of thing which is the subject of the hour in newspapers at the present moment. A, the war's still going on, and the fortunes of war can change. And B, it's one thing to hold a victory concert in the ruins of Palmyra. It is actually another thing to say you're going to rebuild them. You know, you're going to put it all back, just like this. Russia and the regime. Bad because, A, it's risky at the present time. And there's another debate to be had about how you do it and whether you use the sort of technique that produced the arch, the triumphal arch in Trafalgar Square, or whether you do it in the painstaking way that archaeologists would probably prefer. But that's a debate for the Syrians to have afterwards. It's a debate for a qualified and supported Syrian administration. I mean, heritage shouldn't be expropriated. It will be, they'll try to, but it shouldn't be expropriated by one side in a war in order to score a point. It's dangerous, I think, for that same heritage in the longer term, if that's what happens. That said, I mentioned the Director General of Antiquities in Syria. That institution, I think, has done a good job. You've all heard about Khalid al-Assad, the former director of Antiquities in Palmyra, who was murdered by ISIS, and how he defied them. And generally speaking, I mean, there have been more than one martyr, not just in Syria, but in Iraq too, from Antiquities personnel who've been been engaged in protecting these sites and lost their lives in the process. In Syria, the Directorate General has tried, I think, to move things, as they did out of Palmyra, bravely, to safety from the museums. They've sought to stabilize monuments like Crac de Chevalier, which have been hit. They've tried, insofar as possible, I think, to be apolitical. You see in the newspaper this morning, the Times, it's happening again because the Russians are doing stuff inside or on the edge of the monument, but there's a very sort of balanced and magisterial statement out of the Directorate General of Antiquities. But in places like Bosra Sham too, which is outside their control, they try to work with the communities and support the people who are there. So that's not a bad news story. My point in saying it is really for the international community. One of the things we can do is to support local antiquities professionals, whether, as I said, the Americans were doing with people in opposition to territory in Marat Norman, or as UNESCO and ICOMOS, which is the sort of an expert NGO which supports UNESCO in these matters, have been doing with the DGAM over the past year or two or longer, really. I will very briefly, because I don't know how much longer I've got. I've got till 3. Oh, great. I just feel I'm sort of pelting on because I wasn't quite sure when. Anyway, all right. Well, let's talk about Libya briefly. because Libya is also important. I don't know if any of you have ever been to see the ancient monuments along the coast in Libya, Leptis Magna, Sabratha, and Cyrene particularly. These are not the only sites in Libya, but they are spectacular. And I went to see Mr. Gaddafi on a mission and managed to sneak off to Leptis Magna. He didn't care, actually, about antiquities at all. I mean, for him, they were just a colonial implant, which is not the way most people in most Arab countries in my other than AQ and that lot, actually see antiquities. But certainly in Libya, this was Gaddafi's view. They were, after all, the Italians and the Romans were their colonizers, so that was how he saw it. Anyway, that's by the by. But if you knew these places, you would have been watching events with trepidation, frankly, in Libya, because you have these great monuments. The country was bombed by NATO, it disintegrated into militias which were contesting over bits of territory, two rival governments, and finally, actually, now also, I'll give them the name they prefer, IS, because you can't really call them ISIS, actually, if they're not in Syria or Iraq. But anyway, we had a debate about this, an implant in Sirte. So there's a really serious situation there, and there are causes of concern. I mean, as elsewhere, Sufi tombs, and a lot of Sufis in Libya, Sufi tombs have been destroyed. The Benghazi Museum burgled. What else? Officials there warning of a notable increase in the trafficking in antiquities. But there are 2 points that I'd like to make about it, because I think they bear on the argument a bit. The first relates to the NATO air campaign. And there too, in this case, national experts and Libyan experts, some of them collaborating with this Blue Shield organization that I'd mentioned, or these committees, did feed in information. And I couldn't tell you, how precisely NATO or the Ministry of Defense or whatever processed all this information. But people have been able to visit these sites since, and they have been able to report such precision that it can only have been informed, basically. That's what they say. So that's an important development. It's important. There are moral questions here about, you're doing something to help the prosecution of a war. But this was a war that was sanctioned by the Security Council, initially to protect civilians. And these steps were specifically designed to protect and avoid damage to important heritage sites in line with the conventions and all the rest of it. So I think it's absolutely the right and proper thing to do. And I can't, with my hand on my heart, say that I have seen all the papers inside and so on, but it does seem to be the case that was this action was informed in the way I describe. The second and bigger issue, really, is that actually the major sites that I've mentioned did come through this conflict. So people say, and obviously I haven't been there, but people who have been there tell me, Leptis Magna, Sabratha, Cyrene, largely unscathed. Cyrene is some encroachment by the locals, but actually the important part of the story, at least as reported, is that the local communities actually acted as best they could to secure that degree of protection of the sites in question there. They didn't have the Gaddafi view, they had a local view which was protective. So that's an important thing, and I think it's an important sort of lesson for the management of these things more generally. Presently, the political situation in Libya looks just a tad more promising in the sense that you have a determined UN mediation, I think. You have an internationally recognized government which has got back to Tripoli, albeit its writ doesn't yet run much further. And the international community, with Italy in the lead, has actually declared its readiness to deploy in support of all of this as soon as that becomes possible. So I think there is a good deal of attention and at least some reasons for hope in respect of Libya that things might actually stabilize a little bit more and a little bit more quickly. But as I say, there are big problems, including an army in the east which doesn't accept the authority of the new government, and IS sitting in Sirte and potentially at least an ongoing threat. On Yemen is different in one way in that actually it managed its revolution better. That is to say, all these other situations I talked about, you have a rapid descent into effectively civil war, or in Iraq, it's anyway. But in Yemen, initially at least, with international support, with support from the UN, with support from the Saudis, there was a transition, and President Saleh, who'd been president since the beginning of time, disappeared. A new transitional government was formed under his deputy. National dialogue took place. And I would have said in my previous job, this is really, because my previous job finished in the beginning of 2015, that this is actually one of those hopeful trajectories, or at least more hopeful trajectories. But in late 2014, a Zaidi Shia militia, the Houthis, advanced on Sana'a. There have been tensions, political tensions, obviously. They took Sana'a, they moved south, and faced with this, Saudi Arabia, I think, was worried about the hand of Iran. They were worried about their own security, and President Hadi, as he then was, sought their assistance. And so in March 2015, an Islamic coalition, effectively led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, began to launch attacks inside Yemen against the Houthis. I won't bore you, it's very complicated because actually Saleh aligned himself with them, and it's all sort of, anyway, it's messy. This is a country which is also really, I don't know, maybe there are people here who really know Yemen. I mean, I've only ever visited it once, and that was, and it doesn't matter. I had to learn the difficult skill of delivering a speech, which is not here today in the same league at all, because I was required to deliver this speech on Yemeni-British relations, which were at a very low point, whilst chewing cut, which is this narcotic which resembles a privet hedge that you put in your mouth and chew, you see. So you could at least sort of become mildly high while you're talking, but it's also actually rather difficult to talk through privet, if you've ever tried. So, I mean, it's a real problem. But anyway, that actually does go to show that the Yemenis have a lot of rather interesting traditions. They do have, and they're very proud of their heritage. It's simplistic to say it, but they are, because they have a very rich ancient history of multiple kingdoms in Arabia Felix, as it was, up until 600 AD, and monuments which bear witness to that. And they also had the most extraordinary vernacular architecture in Sana'a, in the Hadramaut, 3 World Heritage Sites there, just because of the vernacular architecture, apart from the World Heritage Sites like the Marib Dam, which relate to that more ancient history. So this is a very special place. And sadly, I mean, there have been strikes in Sana'a which have hit some of these historic buildings, or the vernacular architecture. I was describing some of it. There have been attacks on other sites. The Marib Dam was damaged. I mentioned it. This is mentioned in the Quran. It's a very special place. There have been attacks which have hit Islamic sites. I mean, in Sada, which is the sort of capital of the sort of Zaidi bit of the country. And in Taiz, the Houthis have for months been besieging the town, and it's very brutal and horrible, I think, what has been happening there to the people of that city. And in the south, there too, you have an Al-Qaeda affiliate, AQAP, which has done what always seems to happen, that is to say, to destroy Sufi and Islamic shrines and so on in the towns that it occupied. Fortunately, it's been forced out of those towns, but it's still not far away. And this is an underreported war, and it's a bit difficult to know precisely the facts, honestly. You have satellite pictures, and you have stories coming out. But because people are proud of their heritage, they have competing versions of what's happened. So it's, to actually dig into the truth is sometimes difficult. But there can be no doubt that there has been destruction, and there would be more were there to be a battle for Sana'a, which could happen. Destruction, I mean, of heritage. However, there is an active peace process. I mean, in this respect, Libya and Yemen do differ from, I think, the present situation in Syria, where things are really stuck. There is a peace process. there is even a sort of cessation of hostilities between Houthis and the coalition just at this moment while talks go on in Kuwait. The Houthis and the Saudis have been talking directly to each other. I think there is a desire to break out of this, but there are so many spoilers, frankly, and it's really rather near to the beginning of the process. So again, I'm not going to give you enormous hope. But I think there will be a will on the part of the Gulf, in particular, to reconstruct, to re-engage, and they understand the impact of all of this. Although there, I would say, and this comes out of a conference that I was at, which Mark was at too, I mean, a very fine Yemeni expert called, I think, Dr. Noha Sadiq, was talking about this, and she said that her concern was that actually cultural heritage will not be considered a priority in reconstruction. I mean, given the quality of the heritage we're talking about, one hopes that it will, but this is one of those issues for the future. And that's what I want to talk about now, just in this last few minutes, really. What do we do? Well, I'm the most important thing that can happen, frankly, for all of these situations, and I include in that Iraq. It's not a question quite of a political settlement, but it's of political accommodation, a coming together, a diminution in the sectarianism, making possible pushing back the extremists. This is where the international community really ought to be putting its weight. It is not enough. I mean, I just spent the last 3 years working on the Lebanon issue, or Lebanon, and I heard it said, including from Lebanese, talking about these wars. They're very resilient, they're very resistant to a return of the infection. But what they will say is, well, it took us 24 years to solve our civil war, so it's going to take time. We haven't got time, and the heritage hasn't got time. Refugees don't have time. We don't have time with the extremists. This is impacting all of us. We're seeing what it's doing to the European Union. So, I mean, these are political problems that require a readiness both to really invest and to really promote, I use the word accommodation again, it's a nice sort of diplomatic speak. But that's the first thing that needs to be done. But anyway, that aside, what can be done now? I was reading an article by an American professor about post-revolution Libya and the cultural heritage there, and she'd been working, I think, in Cyrene, and was a great expert and so on. And her conclusion, I have to quote you because it's, all we can do is watch and wait and hope for the best. I didn't think this was desperately helpful. I mean, come on. We have to have more thoughts than that. I mean, the first and most obvious thing we can do, and the world outside can do, is to digitize, to record tangible heritage, to monitor the damage done, whether it's through satellite imagery or through contacts with the heritage professionals, folks on the ground, to pool the knowledge. I have an appalling sense of so many academic groupings and institutions, but the extent to which they sort of always share their information, I'm not sure. So that, when the day comes, the assessments can be made quickly, the remedial action can begin, and you can move forward. And so that actually, just to go back to a point I made earlier, if you can identify particular acts of vandalism and the vandals, you take them to court. I'm a great believer in that. I think the more it becomes common practice, anyway, at least it should give people pause for thought. Second thing you can do is to provide support, advice, training to these professionals that I talked about, what the ICOMOS are doing with the DGAM, the Director General of Antiquities in Syria, that sort of thing the Americans were doing. People in the front line who really feel lonely and exposed, communities who are on the edge of these conflicts, just to reinforce them, to strengthen their resilience and their focus on the heritage which is within their area. As I said, with, citing the Libyan example there. And the good news, and there is good news here, one of the pieces of good news is that the British Museum has a program which Mark is involved with, so I won't go into it deeply, but they're training Iraqi professionals so that they will be, again, it's all sort of expert speak, they will be expert in things like emergency retrieval struggles, but actually, strategies, sorry. But rather more eloquently, the head of this program, in describing it, said that they would create a team of local archaeologists who can see beyond the barrier of despair, able when the time comes to retrieve the maximum data needed for restoration in sites like Nineveh. I mean, that's a more inspiring way of describing what they might do. But it's good, and what is even better is that it proved to be the sort of John the Baptist for a much larger anyway, program announced by the Culture Secretary last year after Palmyra and the other ISIS atrocities. A fund called the Cultural Protection Fund, which the Department of Culture will lead, which I think is important because at least they're thinking culture as opposed to the FCO or DFID or whatever who might be inclined to put it right to the back of the queue. This is, as I said, I think I said £30 million over 5 years. It's good news because I assume that some of this is going to professionals in the area, go to communities and so on, and hopefully will have an impact. The Middle East can be expected to take the bulk of the funds, I would have thought, given the nature of the present threat there. There are people with more ambitious ideas. I mean, the Italians came up with the idea of task forces, national task forces, 50 experts, including police, who would deploy as soon as the moment came, when you could secure access to help protect and to initiate this sort of process, sort of progress in rehabilitation. The idea hasn't caught on, frankly. I think both host governments, where they exist, and possible sending governments each would have reservations about it, but it's out there as an idea of sort of blue helmets for heritage. So that's, what is it, recording, that's one thing we can do, monitoring, providing support for the people who are in the front line, acting to prevent the illicit trafficking, which is Mark's subject, but there's a lively debate here about just how much looted material actually reaches the market. But there are also questions to be asked, I think, about how actively the police actually look for the stuff, frankly. I mean, it probably has to appear under their noses. And it's not for me to be rude about the police, but I mean, they have other things to do. So there are issues there which are to be explored. But really, if you want to cut the traffic, and particularly if you want to cut the proceeds off from ISIS, you do need to be proactive. The United States has just enacted new legislation in line with Security Council resolutions to prevent the proceeds of trafficking reaching ISIS. That was signed off about 3 weeks ago. Fourthly, largely, last thing, encourage people, and there are a lot of people working on, believe it or not, post-conflict reconstruction in the Gulf, I mentioned, but in the UN, for example, get them to write heritage protection into it, because they don't necessarily. I mean, I was exposed to a discussion about this the other day with people who are doing that within the UN for Syria, and it wasn't there in their thinking. But actually for Syria, if you take Syria as an example, 8.1% of Syria's GDP in 2010 came from tourism. And people aren't going to go to visit Aleppo if there aren't ancient souks and there isn't the citadel is a ruin. So, I mean, there, I think restoring in a manner which is sympathetic to the history, and you can all look at examples, whether it's Beirut or Coventry or whatever, where it hasn't necessarily been done, I think is important, actually. So that's an economic way into what is a bigger, in my view, or a wider argument, which is also about the importance of heritage for coming together and identity in the future and future generations, which won't necessarily swing the donors, but I think it's important for the economy argument can. I have 2 last points, and then now I have, you see, you gave me time, and then I have 2 last points. One of these points concerns UNESCO. I mean, I was disturbed, frankly, to read a headline in the newspapers the other day, UK plans to slash support for UNESCO. I'm not asking for more funds for UNESCO, I'm not saying that that's an important thing, but in any situation like this, you need a humanitarian crisis. You do need an international body which coordinates and offers some leadership. Now, UNESCO, way back in the 60s, did that tremendously. These days, it's a different organization. The UN, the Americans have withdrawn funding entirely because Palestine became a member, which is not the fault of the UNESCO officials, but it happened. Whatever you think of it, it happened. It does need reform. If you look at its strategy for dealing with the crisis, it's full of UN speak, which is a bit impenetrable sometimes, but it touches all the right points, and it is the empowered body with the Blue Shield, with organizations like IGMOS. They're there for this purpose. And while not asking for more money for UNESCO, I don't think this is the time to undermine it, frankly. It's the time to support the minuscule staff they actually have working on precisely these issues, and give them encouragement, let them play the role they ought to play. So I wouldn't want to end on a carping note. I don't think that would be right. And actually, fortunately, I don't have to, because as Tim knows, yesterday morning I was watching the Queen's speech, and that's the first time I've ever watched the whole Heritage performance all the way through. It was impressive. And I was really downcast because I was waiting for something to happen, and Her Majesty didn't mention it. But then I was told afterwards that, well, there are sort of, there are a lot of details down below, and you have to sort of consult the different departments and so on. And so the consultation took place. And it's in the newspapers this morning. The government is committed now, 12 years after it first said it would do so, to actually ratifying the Hague Convention. And I believe, because the Culture Secretary said last year, when they did that, they would actually accede to the 2 protocols too, they will do that too, inshallah. So if they do that, then if you put it together with the Cultural Protection Fund, we will actually almost be in a position where we are able to do what we ought to be able to do. I mean, this is a country which esteems heritage, I think, and has an enormous body of expertise. But actually here we've been at the back of the queue, and back of the queue in terms of the formal legal action that needed to be taken, but also in terms of the political messaging. I don't mock the Italians. They were coming forward with an idea because they thought it was really important. It may not work, but at least they were offering an idea and leadership. Well, now we're putting ourselves near the front of the queue, and hopefully there will be follow-up. So there we are. Thank you very much.